If deposits are leaving banks and going to money market funds, doesn't this mean more strict lending, which can further crush balance sheets? Yeah. I mean, tightening of lending standards, if you want to look at it that way, for sure. So, I mean, just to be clear, we've got bank reserves that are on the Fed's balance sheets that are assets of these banks. And if that customer with a deposit says, hey, I want my deposit to go into a money market fund, and that institutional, it's got to be institutional money market fund. Well, I guess it doesn't. Technically for M2 it does, but let's forget about M2 because we're just looking at the Fed's balance sheet. So then that money market fund takes the deposit from the customer, moves it to reverse repo, and then those bank reserves go from the reserve accounts of the commercial banking system in aggregate total all the way down to the reverse or up or wherever it goes. On my whiteboards, I always put it below. So it goes into the reverse repo account. So that is effectively quantitative tightening. There are fewer, without the Fed decreasing the size of their balance sheet, there would then be fewer bank reserves. Now, I don't know that the banks are really constrained by reserves, especially with what, 3 trillion still in the system. But they are constrained when it comes to confidence in counterparties. That's the way I like to look at it. Because if a bank wants to create dollars, they'll create dollars. You know, if they wanted to create dollars to bail out Silicon Valley Bank, they would have done that. They would not have had to go into the Fed or whatever. Just name your bailout. So the balance sheets are not constrained from that standpoint. But what is constrained from the standpoint of lending is the confidence that someone's going to pay you back. So when there's very low confidence that someone's going to pay you back, you need a lot of reserves in the system. With very high confidence, then you don't need many reserves at all. And the best example of that I can give is prior to 2008 and 2007, most of you guys know from watching my videos, the entire banking system only had about 40 billion with a B in bank reserves. Now they have 3 trillion plus. I haven't looked at it lately. I don't know if it's 3 or 4 trillion, but it's a hell of a lot higher than 40 billion. But M2 has gone up, but it hasn't gone up that much, right? And so another great example I always use is in 1980, they had 40 billion in reserves, but 1.5 trillion in M2. And in 2007, they had 40 billion in reserves, not one dime more than they had in 1980. But yet M2 had gone from 1.5 trillion up to 7.5 trillion. So that just goes to show you right there that the banks are going to expand their balance sheet regardless of what's happening with reserves. Another thing that you guys might find interesting, and actually I should do a whiteboard video on this because very few people realize it. Even the talking heads on CNBC and the quote unquote experts, they believe that the Fed creates the amount of reserves based on how much liquidity they want to provide or based on how much lending they want to see in the real economy. So if they want to decrease lending, well, they'll just go ahead and create fewer reserves. They'll take liquidity out of the system, and that's going to put disinflationary pressures on the economy or vice versa, right? They want to increase inflation. They're going to pump in more reserves. The bank's going to lend more because they got more balance sheet capacity, blah, 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 blah. You guys know the story, right? You hear it every single day on CNBC. But in reality, it's the opposite. The Fed does not create reserves, and then the banks lend around how many reserves are in the system. That's the view of 99%, even of the experts. And like I said, it's completely the opposite, meaning that the banks lend to whoever they want to lend to. The banks lend, forget the reserve requirements, forget any of that stuff. Basel III might impact a little bit, but I think they've got ways around that. Banks lend, and then the Fed creates reserves around how many loans the banks are creating, therefore how many reserves they need. Now, right now, this isn't applicable because we're in the age of quantitative easing when they're absolutely flushed with reserves. But you go back to, let's say, 2006, prior to that, before we did QE, when they would try to micromanage the overnight rate just by doing little bursts of buying, little bursts of selling, and try to get that rate where they wanted it, right? The Fed funds rate. So what would happen is the New York Fed, the trading desk, they would look at and they would talk to the banks and they would try to determine how many loans they were going to create over the next quarter. And then what they would do is they would say, okay, where do we want the rate? And then they'd say, okay, well, how many reserves do we need to create in order to give the banking system enough reserves so they can meet their reserve requirements based on how many loans they're going to create? And you say, George, this is completely contrary to every single thing that I've heard in the mainstream media, every single textbook, every single blah, 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 blah. All the experts, all the gurus that I listen to. This flies in the face of what they say. They say the reverse is true. In fact, they base almost their entire worldview on macro. That the reverse is true. So why should I believe you? Don't believe me. Don't. Just believe the Fed. So what I mean by that is I've gone back and read blog posts, I've read papers that the Fed themselves wrote summarizing, and they do this every year. They have this summary report. Well, at least they used to prior to QE, where they would say, this year we were doing this, 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 and this. And they would kind of outline what they did the entire year to manage open market operations, or to manage how they would, or to summarize, give you details on how they would, a detailed summary on how they would get the rate, the Fed funds rate, how they would keep it in their range or keep it at that specific number prior to quantitative easing. And they say over and over and over again that they don't create the reserves and then the banks lend. They say the banks lend, and then they try to figure out how many reserves they need to satisfy the banks, and then that's how many reserves they create. The Fed says this over and over and over and over again. Why nobody listens to them, I don't know. And even in the Bank of England has said this in their 2014 paper that I reference in tons of my whiteboard videos. And you can just Google, it's like, I forgot the name of it, but just Google Bank of England monetary system 2014 PDF, something like that, and it'll pop right up. You can read it yourself. And they say the exact same thing. They say the banks lend, and then the central bank creates the reserves to match that lending. So anyway, I know that was a tangent, but I think it's very important that you realize, and I say this over and over and over and over again, and now maybe you'll realize why I say this, is when you look at the monetary solar system, the Fed, I don't know if you guys heard that thunder. That was, wow, geez, that's a pretty severe thunderstorm here. But anyway, if you look at the monetary solar system, everybody thinks the Fed is the sun, and all the banks kind of revolve around the Fed, just like the planets, when in reality, it's the complete opposite. If we look at that monetary solar system, the sun is not the Federal Reserve of the central bank. The sun is the commercial banking system, and the central banks are the planets that revolve around them.